Lesson 4, Himmler, the SS, and terror. Since the SS played an integral part in the final solution, it's fundamentally important that we understand the nature of the SS, how it was founded, its leader, and the element which the SS brought to Nazi Germany, which helps us perhaps grasp the question to the degree that the state or the people in Germany were forced to do what they did through a systematic terrorization. Now, the tagline underneath is a state within a state, although that'll sort of become clear as we go through this unit. The SS, of course, was a bodyguard, sort of envisioned to be the elite flag holders for Nazi Germany. And all of the SS members, of course, when joining, had to swear an oath to Adolf Hitler. I swear thee to Adolf Hitler, as Fuhrer and Chancellor of the German Reich, loyalty and bravery. I vow to thee shalt appoint obedience until death, so help me God. And it is an oath, and the notion of oath, that forces people to take what they're doing very seriously. Now, prior to 1933, the SS was initially part of the SA, Hitler's bodyguard part of the SA. The SA, of course, was controlled by Ernst Röhm. Heinrich Himmler, from an early stages of his sort of Nazi career, which evolves in the middle of the 1920s, will become sort of appointed, chosen, if you will, for high position. He's an ideological Nazi, and I'll explain to you a little bit more about him later. But he'll become leader of this in 1929. And by 1933, the size of the SS and its importance within the Nazi state will become very evident. The story of the SS from the minute the Nazis take power is one of an accumulation of great power. The SS, by 1936, will unify all of the police services underneath him and underneath Himmler and the SS, and Himmler himself will become possibly, next to Adolf Hitler, and most certainly by 1945, the most powerful person in Nazi Germany. By 1939, all party and state organizations involving the police security masters were amalgamated into the Reich security offices. And this is a really good example, and one of the reasons I talk about state within state. The SS becomes fundamentally more powerful than any of the state institutions it sort of mirrors, if you will, including the police. And in fact, by 1939, all of these powers will come under the head of the SS. So Himmler has a responsibility for the development and control of a massive apparatus of terror. And he is, of course, because of his powerful position and his loyalty and proximity to the Fuhrer, mostly by choice. Hitler really likes Himmler, and therefore he becomes answerable only to the Fuhrer. And his proximity to the Fuhrer allows him to get a lot of things done, and at the same time accumulate tremendous power for himself. Now, Martin Housden, the historian, says to understand Himmler is to understand the nature of the Nazi movement, the terror state. Now, what do we need to understand about Himmler? Himmler, in himself, is a new kind of German. And he wants to create a racial state. He wants people to be stronger, tougher, particularly mentally. He's of the opinion that if horses can be bred, why not human beings? He sees a nation, and therefore humankind, in very organic terms. He believes Germany had been infected by pacifism, liberalism, humanitarianism, that foreign races had divided and polluted Germany. And he becomes a massive advocate of survival of the fittest. He believed, again, through the SS, that part of his goal, his mission, was to create a new, stronger, more fit German race. And to do so, they would need to purge the nation of those who were inferior. And hence the SS becomes, by ideology, and that of Himmler, that is, associated with the terror state. Since the SS is the one who is responsible for the sort of furthering of this ideology, it only becomes natural in this Nazi state that the SS will become in charge of the apparatuses of terror, the concentration camps, later the death camps, the Gestapo, the military police, the civilian police, et cetera, et cetera. And by the let's say by the time for the Second World War rolls around, the SS really comes to symbolize what's known as the aristocracy of National Socialism. Members of the SS are considered to be the best, really the standard bearers for National Socialism, and that's partially due to the propaganda. It's partially due to the fact that the SS, from its very ideological background, is looking for the perfect German and will accept nothing less, nothing more. It's quite interesting. Heinrich Himmler himself modeled the SS, at least in its structure and its the way its selection process worked, on the Jesuit order of teaching priests who were supposed to be the standard bearers or the sort of the conversion arm of Catholicism. Now, the Jesuit priests are the people who go to the wilderness. Canada, for instance, where I come from, it was mainly discovered, and at least many of the contact made with the first peoples were done by Jesuit priests on missions to convert people in the hinterlands, the previously unknown hinterlands. And the SS sort of viewed themselves along the same light. Their organizational structure was exactly the same as the Jesuits, and their sort of vision of themselves mirrors that of the Jesuits, that they would be the sort of the forebearers of National Socialism, go into new lands and turn people into the ideal National Socialists, the ideal Nazis. And of course, for those people who viewed in terms of the organic nature of society as being unable to be, despite their best intentions or wishes or force, perfect National Socialists, the SS naturally comes to be the element of extermination for those individuals. The number two in charge of the SS is a very important man to understand as well. His name is Reinhard Heydrich. Heydrich will be killed in 1943, actually, by Czechoslovakian partisans, and which will lead to horrendous reprisals, which is an interesting story amongst itself. He rises through the ranks along with Himmler. He's intelligent, cultured, he's a good athlete, yet he's totally ruthless. And Heydrich will be in charge of the SS, broadly speaking, in the conquered territories. And he plays an instrumental role in the escalation and the radicalization of what eventually becomes the final solution. Hitler will call him the man with the iron heart, and he's known commonly as the young, evil god of death. Now, the turning point for the SS is really the Night of the Long Knives. The loyalty to Hitler leads to massive SS involvement. In fact, leading Nazis begin to view the SA with unease, and Ernst Röhm is too powerful. Himmler himself will concoct a story that Röhm was planning a coup on Hitler, which may actually, interestingly enough, may have been true in the long term, but particularly not true of June of 1934. Nevertheless, it was enough for Hitler to allow Hitler to carry out what's known as the Purge, the Night of the Long Knives, which cures two things. Number one, it sort of puts a damper on the radicalization of the SA, which was beginning to cause Hitler problems of legitimacy at a time when he was still hemmed in by the conservative elites who got him into power, and Hindenburg, who was still president. And of course, Hindenburg is still alive for 2 months in June of 1934. Now, this allows the SA to be effectively destroyed, and the SS will become the prominent Nazi organization. And eventually, the aforementioned SA will become entirely merged in the SS organization. The SS police system, which evolves after 1934, then comes to be all-encompassing in Nazi Germany. Their first primary goal is intelligence gathering. Heydrich was initially responsible for this. This role will grow, obviously, as the Nazis will spread their power over occupied territories, and the need for intelligence to root out insurgencies or to find potential Jews or undesirables or communists lurking within their midst becomes incredibly important. They have a role over policing. Eventually, all members of the police, including the hated and feared Gestapo, will be functionaries of the SS. They will use a combination of surveillance and repression. They're incredibly brutal. They practice arbitrary arrest and imprisonment. There's basically no laws for due process in the Nazi state. Therefore, the extent to which the Gestapo can go towards terrorizing people is quite far. They'll discipline the opposition. Of course, it's natural that the SS, with these roles, will be put in charge of the concentration camps. They'll manage the torture chambers. And initially, these are mostly for political undesirables, such as members of the ultra-left-wing arm of the SPD, the KPD, the Communists, and the SPD members themselves who didn't fall into line. That is, the former Social Democrats who ran for the majority of the time the Weimar Republic. Dachau set up as a model concentration camp outside of Munich, and after which really an entire organization of concentration camps will come. They'll normally be placed next to rail lines to promote easy transportation. They'll also be heavily concentrated in industrial areas to provide a ready use and ready form of slave labor for the Nazi state. Military action as well. The SS wasn't content, of course, to be just the police service. They are the standard bearers of National Socialism. It is only natural then that Himmler should seek and be granted the permission to set up a military attachment, which will be completely independent of the German army, although fighting along with it, known as the Waffen-SS. And this will grow enormously influential. By 1941, it's the Waffen-SS who lead Operation Barbarossa into Russia. And it's not the regular German army or the Wehrmacht, as it's known. They saw their role as a creation of a new order, and the Nazi Waffen-SS become probably the most feared shock troops of the Nazi state. And they're famous, of course, for fighting to the death and very rarely surrendering unless completely up against it, if you will. And of course, the SS army groups will, within the Waffen-SS, will include organizations such as the Einsatzgruppen, who were responsible for following the advance of the Waffen-SS and then integrating the conquered nations of Europe politically and racially under the Third Reich. This, of course, will be a much more difficult task in the East, where there are less quote-unquote Aryans, a more easy task, if you will, in the West, where the Germans broadly consider the French, even though not humongous fans of the French historically, at least they're Aryan. And as such, the roles of the groups like the Einsatzgruppen, which fall under the Waffen-SS, their role becomes, I guess, less pronounced than it does in the East. During the war, because of the nature of how the SS was operating, the responsibility it had for the pacification of these newly conquered territories, Himmler's empire is allowed to grow significantly as the Germans take over new lands. He gets control over the camps, the resettlement of people, the extermination. He also, because the Waffen-SS is leading this, gets the potential for exploiting these new territories for economic gain. And soon, as I mentioned, the SS rivals the power of the army. Overall, by the time 1943, 1944 happens, the SS is simply the most powerful organization in the whole of Nazism, and Hitler relies fundamentally on the SS. They're acquiring powers at a remarkable rate. As I'll talk about later on, the SS starts to develop into what's known as a state within a state. Literally, Himmler himself has the ability to operate almost independently of the Nazi state and alongside it. There are two divisions of the SS that you need to know about that are particularly active in respect to aspects of the Jewish question. As the aforementioned Einsatzgruppen, which were founded in 1938 to Nazify Austria after Anschluss. These are special units. 4 of them operated in the East following the German army. Most of them are led by highly educated Nazis. In fact, Einsatzgruppen North, the first one was led by a professor of, I believe, philosophy. There was one Einsatzgruppen Center, was led by a person with 2 doctorates who went by the name of a doctor. One of, I guess, the great ironies is some of the most educated people in all of Germany were the people perpetrating the most horrific moral crimes in the East. All that said, their broad goal was, upon the launch of the invasions of the East, is to purge all agents of the Communist Party and their Jewish supporters. And this was in a direct written order given by Reinhard Heydrich. And this was broadly interpreted to mean both Bolsheviks, okay, people who believed in communism, particularly in Russia, and Jews. Now, Jews are broadly interpreted to be agents of Bolshevism because of the association of Jewish Bolshevism, something that had been inherent in sort of propaganda or sort of the belief system that would center on the foundation of Hitler's beliefs for about 30 years. So the Jewish people were murdered indiscriminately as agents of Bolshevism first, which actually, interestingly enough, furthers the radicalization of the actions of the Einsatzgruppe in the East. Overall, the Einsatzgruppe will murder in cold blood, mostly by shooting over 1 million people. The second group were the death's head units. Once the concentration camp system is established, the death's head units ran them. First, they ran them for political prisoners. They become very immersed in sadistic brutality and ways of dehumanizing people. These are the people who, in 1934, will create a system of numbering people, which, of course, is something used in the Holocaust. But initially, people lost their personal identity by being numbered. In 1942, Himmler will order the building of the first concentration camp, and that will be built in the east. The first extermination camp, and that will be built in the east. And that will be sort of a response to the work of the Einsatzgruppe is doing and their inability to carry out efficiently what Himmler sees as a necessary task for the establishment of the German dominance in the east. The death's head units, therefore, linked to the Waffen-SS, were mostly comprised of sick or injured SS men who were given quote-unquote light duties in running the extermination camp. This also meant that those who refused could be shipped out back to the front. So the fact that people who had been heavily involved in the fighting in the East ended up a lot part in doing light duties in the extermination camps. If they objected in any way, they would be sent back to the Eastern Front, a place of immense horror and brutality and terrible fighting. So a lot of people actually make the decision to stay in the relatively cozy environment of the extermination camp, if that's hard to believe, as a choice to avoid fighting on the Eastern Front again. Now, as sort of an aside to help us gain a deeper understanding of the SS, I thought I'd run you through a couple of the major historical debates that we've discussed already and how the SS can play a central role in understanding these historical debates. And the first one was that nature of a state in the state. In one of our last lessons, you talked about the fact that eventually the Nazi party starts to usurp the traditional state functions, and then later on the party itself, not functioning as a cohesive bloc, begins to split. And the state within a state is more a function of the party split. Now, Himmler, as I mentioned earlier, is able to accumulate a massive power block. The nature of Nazi rule allowed him to gain more and more power. He becomes, by the end of the war, the Minister of the Interior, the head of the Reserve Army, the head of army armaments. And this is at the same time you have Albert Speer being head of the economy. So you have essentially the SS undermining the economic ministry and accumulating the ability to industrialize itself. The war allows Himmler to further his power on a massive scale, and he has literally carte blanche to crush all opposition. He does have a few limitations, which indicate that it probably hasn't achieved a state within a state. In fact, Albert Speer even says the SS were on their way to becoming a completely independent body, more or less. But by the time the war ended, time had run out. So they have some significant limitations, which perhaps don't mean it's completely a state within a state, but it's almost on its way there. Number one, the Gestapo, the aforementioned Gestapo, is an interesting case. It's incredibly small. It relied on collaborators to do their denunciations, and therefore where collaboration ended, so did control of the Gestapo. For a very interesting example of that, watch Nazis: A Warning from History, the middle part from approximately 20 minutes to 37 minutes, where it talks about the need for consent for the Nazi state to work. So you have the Gestapo, a loose, disunited organization, the SS being a loose, disunited organization. Its only really uniting features itself perhaps are Himmler and a sense of being Nazism's political soldiers. And you have the SS's inability to take over all of the Nazi functions. In fact, there are prominent Nazis right up to the end who, despite his efforts and despite actually a general distaste or dislike between the two of them, Goebbels and Himmler, are able to hold on to significant power centers. Goebbels still controls propaganda and culture, and his prestige actually grows during the war from 1942 to 1945 as he's needed more and more to rally the people against inevitable defeat. He actually accumulates more power. So the SS isn't quite ready to subvert the state. So there's sort of that you get a sense of how the party in and of itself is fragmented. And it also helps you understand whether or not Hitler was a weak or strong dictator. Of course, if you were a strong dictator, a dictator would naturally be threatened by a person like Himmler growing to be massively powerful, almost becoming independent of the Hitler state. And structuralists will argue this shows Hitler's weakness. The fact that Himmler came to dominate and by the end of the war was in a position potentially to usurp Hitler, as most certainly in the East. On the other hand, Coercion, WTF theory, working towards the Führer, argues that this shows the dynamic of the concept of Hitler, speaking in visions, laying down broad Nazi policy, but allowing people to effectively get on it. He says that Himmler potentially is the best example of this, and this shows his theory of working towards the Führer instantly, that the Führer is central, but Himmler is allowed to obtain this power alongside the Führer through unquestioned loyalty and working along the lines of his wishes fanatically up until the very end. Therefore, because he never deviates from this plan, Hitler lets him get on with it. The second argument is terror. As I sort of briefly mentioned, the fact that a lot of people have put on the fact that the Gestapo, who were the men in trench coats, the people that quote unquote were on every corner spying on the German people, were actually not. The work of the Gestapo was built basically on an informer society. Popular denunciation was the most important factor in the work of the Gestapo. German society endorsed the terror apparatus and accepted the role of the apparatus because it helped them rid themselves of people like asocials, Jews to some extent, political undesirables, the threat of communism. And National Socialism in many ways was seen as popular justice. The vast majority of the population isn't touched by the terror state, and they don't need to be. Therefore, the structuralists will see that there's no need for a heavy-handed terror. German society, they believe, was complicit. They were self-policing. They gave over information to the Gestapo. The Gestapo run entirely on informants. And therefore, the society identified with the political and social aims of the regime and effectively let the regime get on with it. On the other hand, the intentionalists see the role of the SS as being not only just direct suppression, that is, throwing people into concentration camps, establishing a all-encompassing fear. The idea that the regime was not concerned enough just to suppress active opposition. It sought to eliminate even the tiniest signs of discontent and basically squash anything that might suggest that the country was not massively and wholeheartedly behind everything it did. So where do we fit? Most people, it's become very common amongst historians to generally agree that, oh, well, the terror state was very small. How can only a couple hundred Gestapo agents look after a city of several million? There's no way it can catch everything. Think of the difficulty the Met Police has catching all of the crime in London. Imagine an organization that is 1/100th the size of the Met Police trying to police German cities of, quite large size. It's just impossible. Therefore, it's become very in vogue for the structuralist argument, really, when you look at the SS and the pervasiveness of terror. It's become vogue to say that, this is very much a consent society. And again, with many of these things, I sort of fall on the fence. Now, I thought it'd be interesting to look at Richard Evans's argument because I think it's very important. And it's not to diminish the fact that consent is an extremely important notion here, and the work of the structuralists has been very important. But what I think we see more than anything is what's known as terror from below. The idea that the Nazi terror, yes, wasn't necessarily as heavy-handed as previously thought, or at least portrayed by a lot of the people trying to save their necks in the Nuremberg trial, that terror was a little bit more nuanced. Now, just taking a look at the camps. First, they were for political prisoners, then asocials. The camps were shrouded in mystery as to what takes place. Fear of rearrest for former inmates kept them quiet. Public knowledge that there are camps, people knew. It's really important that people knew this. Therefore, they knew that there was a place for them if they stuck out. the block wardens, these are the people who were working for the Gestapo, who were supposed to be on every corner listening to you. And these people were really the lowest rung in the Nazi hierarchy. They're in charge of bunting and flags, but also, I suppose, the first port of call for people who want to denounce their neighbors. There could be some class divide between the block wardens and those they oversaw. There were similar figures, such as foremen, etc., at work, who helped along. So there's a little bit of element there. There are some interesting national plebiscites as well. The Nazis will gauge their popularity and at least sell some of their actions to the international community by holding plebiscites, which are effectively referenda on certain subjects, such as, do you support Adolf Hitler and his reign and everything he does? And of course, the Nazis would rate these plebiscites. This is sort of an element of the terror state. There's sort of a wide latitude to interpret spoiled ballots as yes, for instance. Those who refused to vote were arrested. The brown shirts were present at polling booths. 3.5 million spoiled ballots in the 1933 election alone. In 1934, when national plebiscites are held on the actions of the Nazis, signs like "National traitors enter here" over polling booths intimidated people from voting or voting the wrong way. Still, in some areas, the yes vote, that is, the vote that supports the Nazis, is low. Half of these, up to half of these, or some estimates, 70% of these, are potentially not favorable for the Nazis. But by 1938, when you see the Nazis give another plebiscite, this one particularly about the unification of Germany and Austria, you get 99% support. Okay, people are forced from their homes to vote. They're taken to the booths. Those who refuse are beaten. People are publicly abused. People are numbered secretly to identify no voters, and the yes ballots are simply handed out by the brown shirts. Therefore, these national plebiscites are basically rigged. So it becomes very difficult to really find information that supports a consent theory broadly. So, I've read things that says that the national plebiscites very much show that the Germans overwhelmingly supported the Führer. And obviously, yes, they do, but you need to understand the environment in which these plebiscites were held. So the question then becomes, how far did terror penetrate? And there's very little evidence that the ordinary Germans live in abject fear of the Nazi state. There are lots of examples of the Nazis not enforcing punishments on people who have clearly broken the rules. There's a really good example of the Gestapo arresting people and basically determining that this person really isn't a big threat to Adolf Hitler, even though he's not a supporter, and letting them go. Again, too, the Gestapo is too small to effectively terrorize everyone. They, of course, rely on denunciations. So there's, some evidence of approval groups targeted by the police state, but there's very, very little evidence of an overwhelming terror state. So what does this suggest ultimately? Well, evidence concludes that despite all of this, there is a definite atmosphere of terror. 1933 to 1935, opposition is crushed, and anybody who is directly opposite to the regime finds themselves dead. From 1936 onwards, small groups are targeted for the rest. Fear and terror retreats into the background. People are fundamentally afraid of the regime, even though they don't live in abject fear on a daily basis. Terror itself is highly selective, and which leads to sort of this idea of self-surveillance. People know not to go very far, not to talk openly about their detest for some policy that the Führer is making. Moreover, people are made aware of a process that occurs. Malicious gossip is put in the newspapers. People read of, and the Nazis make they don't hide the fact, if you will, what they're doing to the people who speak out against the regime. They're letting people know where the line is. And even though the Gestapo isn't there everywhere, there is a belief that the Gestapo is there and that the denunciers are everywhere. The terror affects all groups. Conservative Catholics feel terror. And you've just got to think about the fact that, why do the Center Party vote for the Enabling Act? They vote for the Enabling Act because they're afraid what will happen to them will be similar to what happens to the KPD and the SPD. They know the punishment, if you will, and really in an effort to save their own necks and perhaps preserve what's left of their independence, they vote to give Hitler dictatorial powers. All classes are tried for malicious gossip. This isn't something just for the workers. It's pretty wide-ranging. And a wide range of official bodies are feeding information from the Gestapo. As sort of mentioned earlier, you have people like foremans in factories feeding information to the Gestapo. You have smaller rungs on the ladder, such as the block wardens feeding information up. And of course, you have your neighbors or your children or teachers who have been Nazified feeding information to the Gestapo. So there is definitely an atmosphere of terror. So is terror all pervasive? The answer is no, but certainly people knew it was there and therefore were compelled. And as Evan says, the truth is that far from Nazis' terror being leveled exclusively against a small and despised minorities, the threat of arrest, persecution, and incarceration in increasingly brutal and violent conditions loomed over everyone in the Third Reich, even as we have seen in the cases brought before the special courts over members of the Nazi Party itself. The regime intimidated Germans into acquiescence, visiting a range of sanctions upon those who opposed it, systematically disorienting people and depriving them of their traditional social and cultural milieu, such as the pub, club, or the voluntary association above all, where these could be seen as a source of resistance. In the case of the labor movement, fear and terror were integral parts of the Nazis' armory of political weapons from the very beginning. So the SS, a very interesting topic, touches on a number of key things, and it brings sort of the notion that terror, though perhaps not as pervasive as we thought, was still an element of control in Nazi society.